The 1990s decade was full of extreme stories and even more extreme art, embossed chromium die-cut covers and superstar creative teams. But there was one event, one incredibly important event that stood above the death of Superman, the breaking of Batman's back, that surpassed Onslaught, Clone Saga, that stood above Infinity Gauntlet and Deathmate. That was when Image Comics was founded and gave birth to a whole new universe, with Spawn, Youngblood, Wildcats, Savage Dragon, and other characters and titles still continuing to this day. Today's story rides on the highs of the 90s and considered the best book of 1994 at the height of the 90s hype. Let's talk about when Spawn and Batman went cape to cape. Batman had gone up against other companies' characters. In the late 80s and early 90s, Batman took on the Predator, Grendel, and Judge Dredd in their own crossover stories between DC Comics and Dark Horse, Kamiko, and Fleetway. In 1989, a rumor was going around that Todd McFarlane and Frank Miller would team up for a DC Comics and Marvel Comics crossover of Batman and Spider-Man. Unfortunately, that iteration never came to fruition, but we did get a turn at the idea from J.M. DeMatteis in 95 and again in 1997, and that wouldn't have been the first time that Miller and McFarlane would work together. It turns out that Todd McFarlane did some uncredited inking work on Miller's The Dark Knight. This came about on recommendation from Todd's friend Klaus Janson, who incidentally will come up later. Todd got to ink some black areas in Book 3 of The Dark Knight. In the 90s, Todd McFarlane and the Image 7 broke away from the House of Ideas, wanting more creative control, Todd wanting to write his own stories with his own characters. So at first, Todd was highly averse to pairing his characters, namely Spawn, with those from Marvel and DC. Having come off a massive run from the adjectiveless Spider-Man title at Marvel Comics to co-found Image Comics, an act that itself shook the industry to its foundation, Todd then published his beloved character Spawn, a character that epitomized the grungy, gritty, dark feeling of that time. One person, perhaps, who himself is considered a progenitor of that very style, Frank Miller, was also riding a wave. An 80s wave from his Dark Knight high to 90s work in Elektra, RoboCop, Sin City, 300, and more Daredevil at Marvel Comics. By this point, Todd had been receiving criticism that his stories lacked substance and direction. Using his clout to counter this criticism of a still new Image Comics, McFarlane, using that and the promise of $100,000 payday for writing a single issue, pulled in the best of the best writers. The idea, to be honest, was greater than the end result, as some of this wound up being less than stellar. Spawn issue 8 was with Alan Moore of Watchmen and Swamp Thing fame. Issue 9, with the first appearance of Angela, Cagliostro, and Medieval Spawn, was by Sandman's Neil Gaiman. Spawn issue 10, done by Dave Sim, who's known for his Cerebus series, and issue 11 was done by Frank Miller, all titans of industry, a veritable murderer's row of peak talent and cachet. This came about because Image Comics, as their name would suggest, put too much focus on the art, and so the stories were suffering. But this was still writers writing his own books. Then, Neil Adams reached out to Todd to work on the Deathmate crossover in the 90s between Image Comics and Valiant, but Todd said no thanks. Then Todd began to think more about it, realizing he was passing on good opportunities he'd most likely regret in the future. Considering it a bit more, he thought Spawn and Spider-Man would be a good pairing, but it was probably too late to reach out to Marvel, since he'd just broken away from them. Instead, Todd reached out to DC Comics with his idea, and despite a preconceived notion that there would be pushback, editor Denny O'Neil said that DC Comics as well was on board and would give enough creative freedom to make it work. Denny said that Spawn and Batman were complementary in the same way that Batman and Grendel were complementary, with similar cities and tones in their books. However, there were notable differences, such as Spawn being based in magic and their moral base being grossly different. For example, Batman doesn't kill and Spawn has no problem doing that. One is a billionaire playboy and the other lived next to a gutter in an alley. Both suffered death and loss, and from those ashes of those tragedies, their new personas arose. Though Spawn has infinite power, Todd says that Spawn is pretty urban, preferring to punch his way out of an alley brawl, and that he didn't, quote, want him to associate with the rocket ship guys. In other words, pairing him with Batman works, Superman not so much. So when the announcement was made that these colossal talents would be teaming up for a new story, the world stopped and listened. For Miller specifically, he wrote Batman when he was young, in year 1, and then at the end of his vigilante career with Dark Knight. So now he was getting to write Batman at his peak. One of the things that McFarlane wanted to play with this book was their differing personality types. Todd noted that Batman, rich and good-looking as he was so into his lifelong mission that he had no interest in dating. Conversely, Spawn, who looks like burnt hamburger, wanted nothing more than to get his girl back. Dixon agreed, saying the only way these two would get along is if they were forced to work together to defeat a common enemy. Batman's more quarterback, where Spawn is more linebacker, Todd says. Frank's story in Spawn issue 11 found him battling a gang of thugs, what Frank likes to call punks, in a bloody, brutal fashion, even going inside Byron, who was the cyborg enforcer of the nerd gang, and bursting out of him from inside, alien chestburster style. Frank Miller wrote one of the bums in this book is someone who dreams about bats, a nod to his Keep Crusader work. In anticipation of what was imminently inbound to comic shop shelves, McFarlane and Miller did a jam piece for the cover of April 1994's Wizard Magazine issue 32. The first book, Spawn Batman Red Scare, was published by Image Comics, while Batman Spawn War Devil was published by DC Comics. The two creative teams weren't collaborating, but it was a competition of sorts to see who would turn out the best book for readers. Spawn Batman is Frank Miller's first work on Batman since Batman Year One. It said that the story is set in the Dark Knight Returns world, and thereby a companion piece to his classic 1986 work. The colorist on this book, Steve Olive, said he reached out to Lynn Varley, who colored Dark Knight, to use some of the stylistic things she did on that book and try to combine it with his own style to come up with a unique, brooding approach to this new coloring work. In the book, Batman was investigating weapons smugglers at Gotham City docks who'd purchased an arsenal from agents of a fallen dictatorship. He followed the clues in the investigation from Gotham City to New York City. Batman ran right into Hellspawn Al Simmons, who it appeared was burning some vagrants alive in an alley, and so Batman swooped in with a heel strike to Spawn's back. Frank's narration says Batman didn't feel bad about a 30-foot drop to drive his heel into a murderer's kidney. Batman, with the element of surprise still on his side, gained the upper hand, but Spawn was superhuman in his ability to absorb Batman's strikes. Since that didn't work, out came a trio of batarangs. Batman threw them at Spawn, but Simmons blocked the weapons with his chains. Next, Batman tried nerve gas to take down Spawn, but that didn't work either, and the two kicked and punched and fought each other to a standstill until Batman had to step back and regroup. Spawn stumbled away, holding back his emesis, while Batman collapsed nearby when his knees gave out. He had to relearn to breathe and put his own arm back in its socket. While he recovered, Spawn encountered a cyborg tied to the arms dealer and attacked. This lady named Nadia Vladova shined a bat signal over Manhattan and lied to Bruce Wayne, saying that the guy in a red cape, Spawn, attacked her building, which was her Heal the World organization, a front of course. Batman and Spawn fought again, this time with Batman wearing his power gloves. They destroyed each other, tearing at their suits and their skin, breaking bones and cracking joints. Again, they battled each other to a standstill, both so beaten and hurt that they couldn't stand despite being mere feet from each other. Nadia used that chance to send a cyborg to attack, and it went after Batman, so Spawn, summoning both strength and his good heart, blasted the cyborg to 1,000 pieces, saving Batman. And then Batman died. His heart stopped. So Spawn summoned his magic to revive the Dark Knight. Spawn inside Batman's head kickstarted his heart again, and then they talked some more, and they finally came to an understanding. Nadia had to be stopped. They battled her gang, and she ended up impaled on a piece of the ship that they were on that had been ripped open, but not before a tactical nuke was launched. So Spawn teleported himself and Batman onto the missile, and it splashed down just as Spawn teleported them both back to his alleyway home. Batman, grumpy as ever, told Spawn that he had no morals, and that his disrespect for human life, along with his lack of discipline, was detestable. Batman promised they'd meet again, but Spawn said, "Hold up, we just saved an entire city from annihilation, and we should bury the hatchet." And that's when Batman said, "Bury this," and he planted a batarang right in Spawn's face. That same year, led by editor Denny O'Neil, Doug Munch, Chuck Dixon, Claus Janson, and Alan Grant teamed up for another story called Batman Spawn War Devil. Munch, Dixon, and Grant were all writing Batman's titles at the time, so they were intimately familiar with the Dark Knight. Claus says that working on the two caped heroes presented him with a challenge with all the chains and flowy costumes, although that did save him from having to do a bunch of background work. This book opens up in 1587 on Roanoke Island in North Carolina, right after the birth of Virginia Dare, the first British child to be born in America. When the ship they had sailed on returned 3 years later with no supplies, the village was deserted, with a single word carved onto a tree: Croatoan. Seen only from the air, the forest around the village was carved out to form a pentagram. And then we fast forward to Gotham City in the present day, where we see Batman investigating Virgil Dare, presumably a descendant of Virginia Dare, and on the trail of terrorists. He'd managed to stop a shipment of explosives already, and meanwhile Spawn was lingering in the seedy underbelly of the city. This time, Spawn was in Batman City. Spawn was investigating his own memories, still trying to figure out who he was and why he had been hired to take out a guy named Simon Vesper. This led to a convergence of the capes at Gotham Tower, a skyscraper finished as the lasting legacy of Vesper. Virgil Dare and his goons were planting their stolen explosives in this very building. It turns out that Batman had been nearby when Colonel Al Simmons did the hit on Vesper that fateful night 6 years ago. Suddenly, on Gotham Tower's opening night, Simon Vesper came back from the grave. Vesper slit Dare's throat to use as his first sacrifice, which would usher in a new world. Inside, Batman found Virgil Dare lifeless on the ground, with Croatoan and a pentagram drawn around him in his own blood. Vesper planned to light 7 massive fires around Gotham City in the buildings he had just purchased to draw a citywide pentagram made of burning, crackling flames, with Gotham Tower, an unholy spire, towering above the city in the center. Right after that, Spawn and Batman battled once more. Spawn's power failed, and so Batman quickly got the upper hand, dropping Spawn to the floor. That was brief, and they got to work together investigating Vesper, with Batman figuring out the shape that Vesper's buildings plotted out on the city map. When Vesper lit up the night, it gave rise to an army of the dead that marched on Gotham City, with Vesper promising they'd all enter through the gates of hell together. Vesper was powered up now and set about attacking innocent civilians. Not even Batman was able to stop him. Spawn ended up in hell fighting the demon named Croatoan, who revealed he was using Vesper as an earthly vessel to do his bidding, which meant Batman was fighting the demon's shell up on Earth. They converged on Gotham Tower, where Batman tossed concussion grenades at the demon, enough for Spawn to use his power to blast Croatoan and shut down the portal for good. Together, Spawn and Batman saved Gotham City. Spawn Batman Inner Demons was a planned book set for 2006, which would have been done by the creative team of Todd McFarlane and Greg Capullo, but that was never released. Todd said at the time that, quote, "For a variety of reasons, mostly on my shoulders, the book never got off the ground, but a few pages and promo pieces were done for it," end quote. He also described what this would have been about: a battle for our heroes' very souls and sanity. Sure, Batman knows how to fight the Joker, Spawn, and the Clown, but what if Spawn had to deal with Batman's legendary nemesis? And for that matter, is Batman really capable of fighting a true demon from hell? Two great heroes must face each other's greatest villains. All was not lost, though, as these two would team up for a 2023 story, Batman Spawn, reuniting the creative team and the characters after quite some time. At San Diego Comic-Con in 2022, during the Jim Lee and Friends panel, a special 48-page one-shot written by Todd McFarlane and drawn by Greg Capullo was announced. In an interview, McFarlane commented on this newest collaboration, said, "Look, this is really simple. I get to play with one of the greatest comic book characters ever, Batman. Get to reunite with amazing artist Greg Capullo, and I'm able to mix in my own creation, Spawn, into the storyline. These are the types of projects many of us creators in the comic industry only get to be a part of a few times in our careers." And so, in 2023, the red and black mixed again. They fought in the same alley where Bruce Wayne's parents were gunned down, a pearl placed there by one of the Court of Owls to taunt him. The costumes and the walls of the alley were covered in their blood as the two beat each other. Spawn hit a dead zone and froze, allowing Batman to press his attack once more, all while the Court of Owls looked on. Spawn thought Batman killed Wanda and was keeping her soul to himself, and that was the thing that got them to talk and work together. Turns out that the Court of Owls thought that Batman and Spawn's loved ones had died at the same moment, and knowing they were working together, the Court of Owls sent their assassin, the Talon, after them. Batman and Spawn went to visit the face-ripped-off version of the Joker for information on the Court of Owls. Afterwards, Joker was playing with a bunch of little Violator demon clowns. Spawn went and captured the Court of Owls boss and gave the Talon an option: your boss or Batman. But it was a setup to ambush Talon. Talon appeared, telling him it was the Court of Owls who set up the hit on Batman's parents to create Batman himself, but Spawn caught him short as the floodlights over the courtyard of Arkham Asylum kicked on. They then all battled right there under the lights. Batman set up the Talon and the Court of Owls, turning an asylum full of supervillains against them. And at the end, Spawn sucked the Talon into his cape and then portaled away, and the crisis was averted. Will they ever meet again? Todd said they're willing to, but want to build up pent-up demand to make a part 2. But whether that happens or not, we'll have to wait and see, which means that's a wrap on this one, my friends. I'm Jesse, this is JLS Comics, and I'll see you soon.